Nintendo has finally shared more details about the Switch 2, and as I watched the presentation, it was both interesting and amusing to see how people's opinions shifted throughout the reveal. It went from excitement about finally getting an updated Switch, right through sticker shock over the new game prices. In case you haven't been following along, Nintendo plans to charge up to $80 for its first-party games in the US, and up to €90 for physical copies in Europe. And earlier this year we had rumors that Rockstar might test the limits of our wallets, with GTA 6 potentially costing up to $100. But before we even found out if that was true, Nintendo showed that the trend towards higher prices is very real, and wasn't just isolated speculation. One of the main arguments defending this increase is inflation. And while that's a factor for companies, it's also an argument against the hike from the consumer side, as our purchasing power keeps shrinking. Other factors like price anchoring perceived value and even the sheer abundance of gaming options available today might suggest this price increase isn't such a great idea after all. On one hand, it makes sense that Nintendo was the first to pull the trigger on higher prices. They're riding high on confidence, coming off the massive success and adulation for the original Switch. And there's something else that plays into this. Unfortunately, the impression I often get is that many people treat Nintendo almost like it's an indie company, one that needs unconditional support and an extra dose of positivity. And I completely understand the nostalgic appeal. I say this as someone who grew up gaming in the 90s, and I recognize Nintendo's historical importance, from helping save the industry during the 80s crash to establishing its well-known franchises and characters. However, nostalgia aside, Nintendo isn't some small or amateur company. It's an industry giant, and as such, should be held to the same standards and scrutiny we apply to Sony, Microsoft, or Valve. And to be fair, Nintendo continues to make excellent games, but the question remains, is this really the right time to implement such a significant price increase? It's worth noting that standard game pricing has remained remarkably stable for years. Even with Sony experimenting with the $70 price point and special editions often costing more, the standard edition for many new releases still hovered around the familiar $60 mark. And without even getting into inflation and reduced purchasing power, two concepts are important for understanding the reaction to these price hikes: anchoring and perceived value. They help explain why this whole issue of raising prices is such a delicate matter. The first is anchoring, which is tied to our price references. We're so accustomed to the $60 price point that anything higher immediately stands out and can spark pushback. This is particularly relevant for Nintendo given its traditionally younger target audience. Many purchases are made by parents or even grandparents who aren't always up to date on everything that's going on in the industry. For them, the perception is straightforward. Yesterday, a game for the Nintendo console cost $60. Today, for a very similar looking machine with the same characters, a similar name and a similar packaging, the price has jumped to $80. Without the clear context of a major evolution, the strong $60 anchor makes it difficult to accept the new price as fair. Of course, the audience isn't limited to just occasional buyers. Many Switch owners are well informed, and for this group, perceived value becomes crucial. A price increase is more readily accepted when consumers clearly perceive what they're getting in return for that extra money. And herein lies a challenge. The leaps between console generations aren't as impactful as they used to be. For the Switch 2, with processing power similar to a PS4 or PS4 Pro, while that's a very welcome upgrade, it might not be perceived by everyone as a revolution justifying such a steep price jump for its games. I imagine this price hike will mainly apply to exclusives, but it's hard to envision a new Zelda or Mario Kart being so fundamentally better or revolutionary that it clearly justifies the extra cost. And stepping back from Nintendo and looking at the bigger picture, the general perception of value in AAA games is already strained. A combination of rushed releases, performance issues, and excessive DLC making base games feel incomplete has led many players to feel that the full asking price isn't always justified. To be fair, Nintendo generally avoids most of these issues with its first-party games, but they're not immune to this general sentiment hanging in the air, that skepticism about whether the delivered value truly matches the asking price. In bringing GTA 6 back into the discussion and looking at the industry as a whole, it's important to remember that base game sales are far from the only revenue stream in today's industry. Ever since the internet became integral to video games, revenue from the initial sale is no longer the only or even the primary way companies profit from their games. In recent years, we've seen an explosion of alternative monetization methods. These range from straightforward approaches like expansions and cosmetic items, to more complex systems like microtransactions and battle passes. We've even reached the point of having entirely free-to-play games, where 100% of the revenue comes from in-game purchases, not the initial cost of entry. This completely flips the old dynamic on its head. As someone once put it perfectly, we used to go into a store to find a game, but now we go into a game to find a store. The point is, while the initial price used to cover most of the player's investment and was the primary profit driver for developers, today's reality is different. The base game is often just the beginning of the player's spending. In other words, the argument that developers need to raise the initial price to stay profitable doesn't hold as much water anymore. There are multiple paths to profitability. And on top of that, the market for hybrid and portable gaming experiences has never been more competitive. And that's exactly where a great alternative comes in for anyone turned off by Nintendo's new prices. If the idea of the Switch 2 appeals to you but the new game prices are putting you off, rest assured, the market offers some great alternatives. For a similar or even lower investment, you can grab a Steam Deck. And for a bit more, the Lenovo Legion Go and Asus ROG Ally are also strong contenders. To be fair, you might miss out on some Switch 2 features, like the 120Hz display or next-gen upscaling, plus Nintendo's exclusives, officially at least. But on the flip side, you have access to a universe of games and sales the Switch can only dream of. These handheld PCs are like Swiss Army knives, combining the best of different worlds. You can play Xbox and PlayStation games, either through PC releases or streaming. You also get access to various PC storefronts and emulation, and you can even use mods. And all this comes with the flexibility of portable or hybrid play. So if you like the hybrid experience of the Switch but have second thoughts due to game prices, don't worry, there are some great alternatives out there. But beyond these individual alternatives, there's a collective and powerful way to send a message to the industry by reviving a practice that seems almost like a distant memory. The art of voting with your wallet seems increasingly rare these days. Every now and then we still see it happen. Movies or games that miss the mark with audiences sometimes flop, but that's not always the outcome. And today's Nintendo is a prime example of how commercial success can persist despite some questionable practices. The new game prices are just the latest example, but Nintendo's practices have arguably bordered on anti-consumer for quite some time now. And yet, despite occasional stumbles along the way, their overall result has remained overwhelmingly positive. Nintendo rarely discounts its first-party games, takes a notoriously aggressive stance on protecting its intellectual property, and often doesn't even offer regional pricing or full language localization for many markets. And adding to the perceived lack of common sense, they're actually going to sell you the Switch 2 stack demo. And if you're in the US and already find $70 or $80 too expensive, imagine how it feels for those living elsewhere, who in many cases are already paying similar amounts for current games due to exchange rates and lack of regional pricing. The feeling of being disregarded by the company feels even more pronounced. And this is exactly where I hope to see a difference this time around. I hope that this time people genuinely choose to vote with their wallets. I hope Nintendo receives a loud and clear message, similar to the feedback Sony received regarding the PS3's initial launch price, or like the lessons Nintendo itself learned from the Wii U's failure and the 3DS's rock start, mistakes that ultimately forced changes. But at the same time, I realize everyone approaches these things differently. At the end of the day, I'm a patient gamer. As such, this price hike doesn't impact me too directly in the short term. I'm perfectly fine waiting for sales, or even skipping a console generation entirely if the prices don't seem fair or appealing. I don't feel the need to play the absolute latest releases. My main criterion is my interest in the game itself, not its launch year. And thankfully, the backlog is practically infinite. In fact, right now I'm even hunting for a PS3 in good condition to explore the games I missed out back then because I owned an Xbox 360 at the time. But of course, I'm not completely immune to new releases, especially when the balance between my desire to play and the price feels right. But beyond my personal preferences lies a bigger concern. What truly bothers me is seeing this hobby I love becoming increasingly expensive and inaccessible, drifting further away from the reality for many people, especially in regions with lower purchasing power. The thing is, a lot of this will depend on our response as consumers, how we vote with our wallets. And I have to say, I don't know how willing people really are to curb their spending as a form of protest. The concern is that Nintendo seems to have fired the starting gun, and you can bet other major developers and publishers are watching the reaction closely, very likely ready to follow suit if they think they can get away with it. On the bright side, perhaps this move will further boost the indie scene with its wide range of price points and possibly bring in more money to subscription services which continue to offer great value. It might also introduce the whole patient gamer concept to a wider audience. We also can't ignore the potential impact on piracy. Not the ideal solution, but a realistic alternative for some when official prices become prohibitive. My personal hope is that Nintendo gets a reality check from the market's reaction, a signal strong enough to make them reconsider and perhaps even discourage Rockstar from pursuing that rumored $100 price tag. And if that's not the case, I'll be just fine diving into my backlog, hunting for deals, and exploring the wonders of past console generations. And believe me, there's plenty of fun to be had outside the latest release bubble. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.